and I'm Daniel Burke, and this is a class on the life of Nicolas of Cusa, who was definitely one of the greatest minds that humanity has ever seen. So this is also an exciting day because we have the news that Tony Blair is on the road to impeachment, which is kind of fascinating and historic and exciting. So just considering that it definitely feels like we're on a precipice and everything can rapidly shift, I think we should look to Cusa for a way to comprehend what's going on around us. So to begin with, I want to put this in the context of something that Lyndon LaRouche recently began a paper with. And this is from his May 9th document, History is Closing in on Obama. And I think this is the crux of whatever it is that we should be doing tonight or any time that we're looking at history and trying to think about what it means for the strategic situation today. So Lyndon begins by saying, the title of the paper is History is Closing in on Obama, the way history closes in on the past. And while he was writing this paper and in the weeks surrounding it, he was very clear about the need to think in terms of 1,000-year arcs. So here's how you would do that, I think. He says, the most foolish and ultimately most dangerous of all popular opinions is the witless presumption that history flows simply from past into future. Contrary to that admittedly popular nonsense, it has often been the case that history assumes its characteristic form in a notable similarity to that uniquely original discovery of the solar system, which as such itself first occurred also uniquely in the work of Johannes Kepler. So how is it that history's characteristic form has a similarity to the discovery of the universe, or discovery of the solar system, rather? I think that's the question, that's the paradox, that's the riddle that you should be concerned with. And I think that dealing with that will give insight into who Cusa was and what these past 600 years have been about, and going back further, really what the past 1,000 years are about. Okay. So, let's see. This is Nicolas of Cusa. Does anyone, let's see, I have everyone muted. I don't know how this works, really, but I can, okay, you can unmute yourselves. All right, does anyone here know what Nicolas's real last name is? Obviously, he's from the town of Cus, or Cusa, as we know it. But do you know what his real last name is? There's a clue on the screen. Okay, so his last name is, no one's unmuted themselves. Stuart, you got it? No? Okay, all right. His last name is Krebs, Crab. He is Nicholas Crab, basically, Krebs. And here you can see his crest after he becomes a cardinal is the cardinal's hat on top of the crab. Over the course of this class, I'm going to present a lot of material about Cusa's life and individuals within it, and I intend, I gave this class about, what, a week and a half ago or longer, and that time it took me about 2 hours. So I want to keep this to, I don't want to go past 8:30 very much, or I guess 9 is the absolute limit for most people. So I'm going to try to, and despite that, I actually have a lot more that I've figured out about Cusa that I'd like to include in it. So expect me to go through a lot of details, and if I were you, I would consider taking notes, not from the standpoint of necessarily the brilliance of the composition of the class, but really from the standpoint of actually just writing down individuals who you think you would like to learn more about, and or places and events and ideas and so forth, that because that's what you should be spurred to do if I do my job right. Okay, so this shows a set of 3 different objects that Cusa owned. He's born in 1401. He dies in 1464. Here are 3 different objects that he owns that we know of, that are associated with the study of this, with astronomy, but also with navigation. The first on the top left is a celestial sphere, which shows you where the stars are in the sky. On the bottom left is an astrolabe, which is invented, before Christ, in actual fact, but is still, used in a slightly refined way around the time of around the 1400s, and it's a way of identifying the angle of a star above the horizon. And on the right is a torquetum. And if you go to Rick Sanders' house, you can play with one. He has one. He had his son built it at his specifications. Rick Sanders even adheres to the belief from Barry Fell, that from the archaeologist Barry Fell, that the Egyptians had a torquetum, the ancient seafaring Egyptians. Okay, so this is a means of looking at the placement of the planets in the sky. So these were the kind of questions that Cusa was concerned with, along with everything else that you'll find out about. And I want to use that as a backdrop for, well, I mean, here's another thing. This is the first map of Central Europe that we know from, that exists in collected history, and it's attributed to Nicolas of Cusa. And let me see if I can. Okay, the mouse pointer is a little bit too slow for this in terms of reaction, but anyway, on the map you can see Germany on the right. To the far upper right is Russia. To the north is, is Norway, Sweden, and so forth, and then to the south, just below the edge of the map, is the rest of Italy. So Cusa was very much involved in the question of geography, of ordering things. And so I want to frame the whole class from the standpoint of this document that he wrote in the year of his death, 1464, and it's called Compendium. And here's chapter 8 of it, which I hope you can see reasonably well. And I've also emailed it out to everyone on the class list. And what it really does, this is not the most important thing from Cusa to read. There's like 6 or 7 other things you should read before you read this, but I think it would be really good for some people to pick this up and to read through it on their own, because I believe that it does a lot to prefigure Book 4 of the Harmonies in his discussion of sense perception, and then a method by which you can go from sense perception to the truth. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this. This is an excerpt from chapter 8, and ask you to take on this concept and use it as a way of thinking about this principle of history that Linden identifies in that excerpt from his paper, History Closing in on Obama. So, chapter 8. Over the course of the first 7 chapters, he's talking about sense perception. He's talking about the fact that, in fact, he says that the difference between man and animal is that he cites all of these things that come from Prometheus. I mean, that are explicitly delineated in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound. He cites the fact that man cooks his food. He talks about man's technology and so forth. And it's very clear what Nicholas's obsession is in terms of the future of mankind in progress. So then he talks about, well, what is really happening when you're seeking truth? And here's a conception of it. He says, therefore, a completely developed animal in which there is both sense and intellect is to be likened to a geographer who dwells in a city that has 5 gateways of the 5 senses. Through these gateways, messengers from all over the world enter and report on the entire condition of the world, doing so in the following order. Those who bring news about the world's light and color enter through the gateway of sight. Those who bring news about sounds and voices enter through the gateway of hearing. Those reporting about odors enter through the gateway of smell. Those reporting on flavors enter through the gateway of taste. And those bringing news about heat and cold and other tangible things enter through the gateway of touch. Suppose the geographer to be seated and to take notice of every report in order to have within his city a delineated description of the entire perceptible world. Now, if a gateway to his city, say sight, always remained closed, then because messengers with news about visible objects would have no entrance, there would be a defect in the geographer's description of the world. For the description would not make mention of the sun, the stars, light, colors, the shapes of men, of brute animals, of trees, of cities, and in greater part would not make mention of the world's beauty. Likewise, if the gateway of hearing remained closed, the geographer's description would not contain anything about speeches, songs, melodies, and the like. The case is similar regarding the other senses. Therefore, the geographer endeavors with all his effort to keep all the gateways open and to continually receive the reports of ever new messengers and to make his description ever more accurate. At length, after he has made in his city a complete delineation of the perceptible world, then, in order not to lose it, he reduces it to a well-ordered and proportionally measured map. And he turns toward the map, and in addition, he dismisses the messengers, closes the gateways, and turns his inner sight toward the creator of the world, who is none of all those things about which the geographer has learned from the messengers, but who is the maker and cause of them all. He considers this maker to stand antecedently in relation to the whole world as he himself, as geographer, stands in relation to his map. And from the relation of the map to the real world, he beholds in himself, qua geographer, the creator of the world. Beholds him when he contemplates the reality by means of its image and contemplates by means of its sign that itself which is signified. During his speculation, he notices that no brute animal, although it seems to dwell in a similar city and to have gateways and messengers, could have made such a map. And hence he finds in himself the first and nearest sign of the Creator. He finds in himself the first and nearest sign of the Creator. In this sign, the creative power shines forth more than in any other known animal. For an intellectual sign is the first and most perfect sign for signifying the Creator of all things, whereas a perceptible sign is the last and farthest removed sign for signifying the Creator of all things. Therefore, the geographer withdraws himself as best he can from all perceptual signs and turns toward intellectual and simple and formal signs. So I think that's pretty interesting, and I think that it does. It's a specific thing that you have to do in terms of whenever you are seeking truth, right? The point in terms of the point in history, right, is that you're going to make a map of everything that's happened, and you're going to look at it, but then you're going to take your map and you're going to consider, you're going to close off your senses, you're going to forget about the sense perceptions, because you know that the sense perception is just a pale, it's just the most confused, most distant from the truth. And you're going to then look inwardly and consider your own nature, and your nature as it is expressed in your own creation, and that your ability of creation is a living image of the divine mind, of the principle of the universe. And so you can, and that's the essential step. And I think that in my dim knowledge of Kepler, I think that's what he's doing. Is he makes a certain map. He sees that there's errors in the map. This is what's discussed in De Docta Ignorantia, is the paradoxes, and then he takes it upon himself to think as though he were God. And this is what Leibniz does as well, of course, very explicitly. And that is essential to getting towards a discovery of reality, namely the discovery of the solar system. So I think this is an insight into what we have to do with history, and I think it's an insight into what's the, as Schiller talks about, to what end do we study universal history? It's for, in the end, it's for your own self-development towards the progress of mankind. So that's what I hope people can take from their own learning about Cusa and his life. And I hope I can show some things that people may not know about what was happening during his life and what was the importance of his actions. So, okay, I'll continue then. But please keep that in mind. So let me start by saying, I don't think that people know. I think that, considering that conception of history, then look at what our map is of history. I mean, people in the younger generations, and obviously, people around my age and younger have a very poor understanding of history, almost no understanding of what happened in the Renaissance in the 1400s, and this is partly because all of the textbooks lie, and partly because people don't feel a connection to it. And so I think that the first thing to do is to situate the strategic situation in the time that Cusa was alive, because that's going to help you to understand the strategic situation today and your own role in it. So the critical factor is what's going on in terms of Venice. Here's a map that shows the red area is the territory of the Republic of Venice, which is really not a republic. It's completely misnamed. It's controlled by an oligarchical group of families, and because they vote on who's going to be their leader, they call it a republic. But it has nothing of republican principles. It's completely evil. It's a continuation of the Roman Empire, and it is completely satanic, scientifically, you might say, right? So, this defines the real critical situation in Cusa's lifetime, is that Venice, which sits between so-called the West and the East, right? Oh, good, okay. All right, Venice, which sits between the West and the East, is controlling the strategic situation by means of monetarism. Okay, so they're controlling the lending that's happening throughout northern Italy, for example. They have a very strong connection to the Normans and to what's going on in England and so forth, and they are in France, and they're the ones who are directing the Crusades. Let me think where I want to start on this. Yeah, I guess that the place to start is to think about what you do know about the Renaissance. I mean, people know that there's Dante is born about 1250, a little bit later than that, and he has a certain vision for a nation state. Petrarch comes a couple of generations later, and in Florence he's consumed with a translation project for Plato. And then what people know about the Renaissance, of course, is that there's massive translation. It's called, Renaissance is rebirth. It's a rebirth of ancient knowledge. And so there's translation of ancient texts, there's a commitment to these ideas, and there's a commitment to Platonism in, I guess that you can call it that, right? So there's a commitment to that kind of identity and to progress. So what's the context for that? Well, the context is that you've had, let me give you a good example. In 100 AD, when the Roman Empire was in a relative peak, and it actually had already begun to depopulate massively all of Europe, and Rome in particular. But in 100 AD, you had a certain peak in the population at 1 million people who lived in Rome. So the Colosseum seats about 60,000 people, and they had, they had 1 million people total. They were all, I think Yankee Stadium is about 60,000 people. It might be, a couple of, it might be slightly different, but it's relatively the same size. So by the time you get to the 1200s, early 1200s, there's been a massive depopulation. I mean, by 600 AD, really, there's been a huge, all of Europe's population has been cut in half. But then that continues. Rome just turns into ruins. It's completely fallen apart. And so you go up to 1400 when Nicolas of Cusa is born, and all of Rome only contains 25,000 people. So that's what you have to have in mind when you're considering the strategic situation, is that you have a total collapse of civilization over the Dark Ages, over this period of imperial destruction. There's bright spots, there's potentials, there's Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick the Great. He's committed to a certain kind of progress. He's committed, and then Dante picks that up, and so forth. But then by the time you get to the early 1300s, Venice has accomplished a coup over civilization, and they've started the total destruction of the population all over again. Populations start falling rapidly again, and you have a collapse of the financial system. There's a financial bubble and then a collapse. And this is the financial system the Venetians really control, that is dominating pretty much all of Europe by this time. So part of the way that they got this financial system set up is through the Crusades. And the Venetians control the Crusades, and they do a lot of terrible things. And this is the next area that one of the next areas I'd really like to study, so I could be some kind of knowledgeable person on it. But here are the horses of St. Mark, which is at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. These horses were brought back from Constantinople when Constantinople was sacked in 1204. And Constantinople was a Christian city. It's the base of the Byzantine Empire. It's the base of Orthodox Christianity, and it's the seat of one of the patriarchies of the 5 patriarchies of the Christian Church, right? So the Venetians got everyone facilitated the trips that people were making on these crusades to attack the Muslim menace, and they were actually using this as a means to bankrupt countries and to loot to their heart's content. And in 1204 they accomplished this vicious treachery of getting the Normans to agree to sacking a Christian city, Constantinople, a great, beautiful city, the seat of, at the time, the most beautiful church that had been built, the Hagia Sophia, and they looted it, and they had the Normans go in there and all the other crusaders, and they burnt down the library of Constantinople, and they viciously attacked the seat of Greek learning, where you had document, you had the copies of Plato's dialogues, you had copies of Proclus, you had copies of all types of critical early Christian fathers. And anyway, so that's the way the Venetians were thinking, and this played into what had been going since the middle of the 11th century, which is the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. So this is another crucial part of the strategic situation, is that you have the Eastern and Western churches are split on a number of issues, but the primary one of most importance is the filioque, where the Eastern Church rejects the idea that the Holy Spirit flows from the Father and the Son. And they claim, no, it only comes from the Father, which is a way of saying that Christ is not really God. He's not a man God. It's a way of rejecting the Trinity, basically, and claiming that Christ receives the Holy Spirit from the Father, and that this is another way of saying that, you know, man does not have the capax Dei, or the God's, you know, the capacity of God, the ability, the creative ability of God. So that's another thing I don't know much about why that happened exactly. It goes back to old heresies that had broken off into the East in, you know, the 400s, but a little bit later, I guess. But it goes back to then. But I don't know exactly why it happened or what was the effect on the Byzantine Empire. But that's how it was. So first the Byzantines have broken off, you know, the Orthodox have broken off, and then the West comes in and sacks Constantinople. So you can imagine what that does to the schism. It will drive a much greater wedge in between the Eastern and Western churches, and the Venetians are the ones who did that, who made sure that that happened. So in the meanwhile, the Venetians, so you know about the Renaissance and how this is a translation of particularly, you know, Plato and so forth. Those translation projects were a large part of what was going on in the Renaissance in Florence in the 1420s up through the end of the 1400s. But there was a lot more, obviously. But this that's one aspect of it that's critical, because you don't have Plato in the West. In the West, you have one dialogue. You have the Timaeus that's in a Latin translation, and otherwise you have practically none. And because there's not this, because of the lack of the Renaissance, that is, no one knows Greek. You know, relatively no one knows Greek, and they don't value it. Well, okay, so who does know Greek? Right? Where is their learning? What is going on? Beginning in 1084, the Venetians have already begun their own translation project. You know, 250 years basically before you have anything like this on the side of people, you know, coming from people who actually demand progress for humanity. The Venetians, 250 years before anyone good ever decided to do this kind of thing, they were doing translations. But their translation project began at the University of Bologna in translations of Aristotle. And they were translating Aristotle massively. They were beginning a university system. I mean, University of Bologna is considered the first university ever. What did people learn there? Because rapidly became huge. Within like a century, they had 10,000 people, students and teachers, I suppose, at the professors at the University of Bologna. But in 1084, they began it, and the whole concept was twofold. On the one hand, you got Aristotle, you got, you know, so philosophy, and on the other hand, you have Roman law, because the Venetians are committed to exterminating any kind of humanist, you might say, any kind of natural law that's Augustinian, that's principled on real Christian values. They're going to exterminate that, and instead they're going to try their best to wipe it out by putting into place a return to Roman law. And Roman law is satanic. Roman law is, you know, the rule of property. Roman law is basically, as my best understanding of Roman law, is that really it's created in terms of a corpus of laws and theory and so forth in order to determine who's going to get taxed, who's going to take the burden of taxation. Because the Roman Empire survives over this long period by, you know, raping and pillaging, taking over territories, and then taxing those people out of existence, and keeping people, you know. So anyway, so then what happens when you tax someone out of existence? What happens when you tax someone to the point where they don't exist? You know, they don't have any kind of means of creating production. Then you got to decide who has to take over the tax, because the Roman Empire can't continue unless the taxes increase or continue at their rate, right? So that's where Roman law comes from, and Roman law explicitly denies the Christian concept, the Augustinian concept of natural law. According to Roman law is what you know in terms of Adam Smith. Roman law is that the natural state of man. They talk about natural law, but what they mean by natural law is the natural state of man is war. The natural state of man is that we're all beasts. It's the law of the beasts, and that's natural law. So that's what the university system set up by the Venetians is intended to do. It's intended to establish that that's the way we're going to run civilization from here on out. And they have a lot of success, right? It becomes huge. You get a bunch of other universities that pop up. University of Padua is a big one. Later Cusa shows up there. There's many more that you can look into. Anyway, so that's what's critical. Meanwhile, okay, what happens in the 1300s? Well, you got to hold a lot of things in your head. First of all, it's at around like 1290 that the Ottoman Empire first starts really gearing up, and they gain a lot of. They're a conquering empire. So another thing I don't know very much about, but it's a critical part of the strategic system, is that the Ottomans are basically encroaching constantly on Europe. And it's in 1453, towards the end of Cusa's life, that they actually take Constantinople. But they're encroaching, they're getting into Europe, they're taking over all, and that begins in about 1290. And the other thing that happens, obviously, which leads to the real crisis in the population, is that you have the Black Plague. And the Black Plague shows up in the Black Sea in like 1340, in the territories around the Black Sea in like 1347, and then these Genoese sailors come back to Genoa. I think they come right back to no, actually it's Florence. Florence is credited with being one of the first places that it spreads from. So they come back, they show up in Florence and I guess other places, but the story is that they come back with buboes, because the bubonic plague is named the bubonic plague because of buboes. And a bubo is a tumor the size of like an egg or a little apple. And these show up particularly on your groin area, on your inner thighs, and if it shows up on you, then you have about a week to live. And some people survive, but very few. And then the other type of plague that spreads is the pneumonic plague. And the pneumonic plague you can catch from people who are dying of the plague, and they're coughing up their germs and the virus, I suppose. And if you catch the pneumonic plague, then you immediately start coughing up blood, and you've got about a day or 2 days to live. And so this leads to, in the heavy urban parts of Europe, you've got like 50% casualties in a very short amount of time. I mean, and the plague will just sweep through, because it goes so quickly, it'll just sweep through an area, and it'll kill out, it'll do a massive kill, and then it'll disappear for like, until next summer. And then it'll come back the next summer, and so forth. And it comes back in waves. And in terms of really bad, I think at Florence they have it like 1347, 48, and then another 12 years later, and then another 5 years later, and then another 15 years later. That's the kind of pattern that it takes. And that goes hard until the end of the 1300s. And so you can imagine the kind of just terror and just the horror of having to deal with this. I mean, like, people would just throw their dead at their doorsteps every morning, and no one wants to touch it. And the cities become, largely abandoned during periods of the plague, because everyone with any kind of mobility, any kind of money, goes out of the city and stays somewhere else until the plague finishes off its business, right? So that's the context for Petrarch and Boccaccio, who are critical figures in Florence at exactly those years in putting out the concepts of mankind that you then see further developed in Cusa. They're reacting against this insanity, this horror, this terror, and at the time it's amidst the fact that you have massive, like, religious cults popping up and religious, fervor from people who are certain that they're certain that the plague is a punishment from God, and so they're going through all these types of cultic, I don't know, wildness and riots and so forth. And so in the meanwhile, you have people emerging who actually decide that they're going to commit themselves to the higher principles of Christianity in particular, right? And one example, good example, is the Brotherhood of the Common Life. Yeah. So let me go into that in a second. Now that you have an idea of how terrible and awful it is, and meanwhile you have these awful wars waging. Another thing I'd like to learn more about. I don't know much about the wars that are going on, but going back, I mean, remember that Dante is killed. He must be killed sometime right around 1300, but he's assassinated by the Venetians as he's trying to intervene into the conflict over who's going to rule Florence. Is it going to be the Venetian-controlled group, or is it going to be people who are actually, thinking about progress? So this is all. It's just terrible. It's just the most terrifying period. Okay, so let me show you a map. Oh, I should have had this up. Because I made a map of all the places that Cusa went. Because it's in that whole context. That's the strategic situation, and there's more. I have to talk about the councils, but it's in that context that Cusa is born. You have to do the screen share. Okay, all right. So I just go here. Why don't you just do full screen, actually? Okay. I'll just show. Okay. So I'll show whatever you have on there. So you should be able to see this map. Okay. You can see all right. So here's Cusa's important places in Cusa's life. He doesn't go to all of these places, but it's important to recognize that he's actually in touch with people from all of these places. I mean, the people from, you'll see, but people from all over Europe are coming to Italy. They're coming to the universities in Italy. They're coming to Rome. They're coming to the great councils that take place during this period of time, and he's meeting them and establishing relationships within that. Strategic relationships. Okay, so in the late 1300s, it's like 1378, a guy named Grier de Groot, basically, I think he becomes he becomes interested in doing some good. Um, he founds what is the first house of the Brotherhood of the Common Life, and actually it's women. There's 16 poor, religiously inclined women come and stay at his house, and they begin to live their lives around precepts that are against the corruption of the church, against the corruption of society, against this terror that's taking place. I mean, over this whole, imagine what's happening to society in this time period. You have this awful corruption of the church. You have in Germany in particular, and in the Netherlands, where Grote is living. He lives in a place called Deventer. There's there's nothing left of. There's very little left. Let me put it that way, of a certain kind of a Christian way of life for these priests. They have concubines. They have the oligarchy controls the priests. The oligarchy controls the monastic orders. There's a handful of monastic orders that are really actually maintaining civilization, but largely you have oligarchical control of all of this. So Grote begins a movement that is committed to educating the poor, and particularly poor children, orphans. And these are people who are committed to going against scholasticism, against Aristotelianism, but sort of more broadly against the idea that you have to have money, you have to be educated if you're going to want to know the truth about God and about the universe. And so they emphasize very simple life. They don't take vows. They support themselves by manuscript copying and various other things. They're part of a northern Renaissance. And out of that comes the next generation is Thomas à Kempis, who many of you may know from The Imitation of Christ, which is a very famous series of it's writings that he put together to his fellow members of the Brotherhood of the Common Life about how to live your life in imitation of Christ. And this is committed to an idea that it doesn't matter whether you're poor or your whole family was killed by the plague. You can live your life in imitation of Christ. And because of the principle of the filioque, that means that you can ascend unto God's thinking, into God's mind. You can see that you can see the truth that way. So this is extremely controversial and extremely difficult. And in fact, what happens, so a lot of people, just as an aside, a lot of people say that Cusa was very much influenced by this. For a long time, people thought that he was actually educated at one of these sort of institutions that were set up by the Brotherhood of the Common Life. By the time you get to 1600, the Brotherhood is basically gone. But okay, so people think that he was involved. In fact, it turns out that he probably wasn't, but that he really loved them. So one person who was involved was a guy named Jean Gerson. And Gerson was the chancellor of the University of Paris beginning in 1395. And he was committed to Neoplatonic mystical theology, which is what, these are just words or labels or whatever, but that's essentially what people, he influences Cusa in a significant way. Gerson is also the person who designs the program of study for Louis XI, the first sovereign of a nation state, right? The first person to implement the conceptions of the Renaissance on his own, for the benefit of his own people, for the benefit of the Commonwealth. So that's Gerson, and Gerson is interesting because he defends the Brotherhood of the Common Life. The Brotherhood of the Common Life is facing charges of heresy. How could you deign to call yourself a brotherhood or a sisterhood if you don't have permission from the church? How could you do this? You don't get to control this kind of thing. You got to listen to You have to listen to the monastic orders. That's what the enemies of the Brotherhood were saying. But clearly, it's because of the political mission of educating everyone. And Gerson defends them. Later, he's important because he defends, in the year of his death, he dies in 1431. In that year, he writes a letter, I guess it's to Charles VII, defending Joan of Arc. So let me go back and find Joan of Arc. Oh, here she is. There we go. Joan of Arc. So Joan of Arc is born in 1412 in a little town called Domremy in sort of northeastern France. It's near the border with Germany and the Netherlands. And another thing that people would really benefit from becoming experts on Joan of Arc's life. But she leads this incredible military campaign, right? And she plants the seed that not long after her death lead to the shift in the political military shift that's necessary for Louis XI's career to even exist. And she has a great enemy. This is a painting from sometime on the left-hand side, from sometime in the 1800s. And it on the right, obviously, is Joan of Arc. And in the red is a guy named Pierre Cochon, whose name sounds a lot like pig in French, right? And he was a pig. And he was a representative of the Burgundians. So the Burgundians are in northern France, and at the time of Joan of Arc's military campaign, they are allied with the Normans of England, right? With the forces, with the English rather, with the forces of these guys, the Henry IV, Henry V, and then Henry VI. And so you have this, this is too complicated to go over quickly, but anyway, we come to a point in the late 1420s where the Burgundians are working with Henry VI forces, and Joan of Arc leads a campaign to try to end that and to take back and to reunify France and so forth. And Cochon is a cardinal, I believe. No, he's not a cardinal. I'm sorry. But anyway, he's a church official, and he's the one who presides over her trial, and it's a huge sham trial. And they are, he controls it massively, and he does everything he can, which is very difficult because she is such a brilliant and devoted person. It's extremely difficult for him to back her into a corner, but finally he does, and they famously, burn her, and then they open up the funeral pyre, make sure she's dead, and burn her again. And before she died, before she was killed, she was told by a guy who was sort of associated with Cochon. We know this from documents that showed up later in her retrial. Joan of Arc is retried in 1455, 25 years later, and she's proven to be blameless, and that lays the foundation for her, to become the national hero in everyone's minds. But she's proven to be completely blameless in 1455, and there's a guy who testifies in 1455 who says that he tried to give Joan of Arc the opportunity to appeal to the Council of Basel, and Cochon prevented her from doing that. The Council of Basel is a critical step in Cusa's career, and so by this I hope to demonstrate that that it was very much at the center of everything that was going on politically in this time period. If Joan of Arc had been able to appeal to the Council of Basel, I highly doubt that she would have been burnt at the stake. So what was going on at the Council of Basel? Well, the Council of Basel, let me just go to my map, sorry about that. So Basel, Switzerland, where today they have the Bank of International Settlements. Here is a picture, if I can get it big. Maybe not. The Council of Basel is a part of a chain of councils that took place, church councils that took place, going back to about, I guess the 1370s, in terms of a particular string of an arc of developments. Here's another. Okay, so here's, as I was saying, the councils are the next part of the strategic situation. If you think about what's going on in the church at this time period, that Cusa is born into, and that Cusa immediately rises to prominence within. 1378, you have you've had a century of French popes, basically, or 70 years approximately of French popes. The papacy has moved from Rome, where it's too dangerous really to seat the papacy, to Avignon, which is modern-day France, southern France, but at the time it was actually not controlled by the French. And over the period of the 1300s, the Pope is basically controlled by the French king, or at least during many periods within the 1300s. There's a very direct influence over the Pope, and this gets everyone really excited, and they don't like it. And so there's a lot of pressure for the Pope to move back to Rome after there's been, some betterment in terms of the political situation there. So they go back to Rome in 1378, and the Pope there, the Pope at the end of his life, I forget which Pope it is, I think he dies in Rome, or maybe he dies in Avignon, having gone back. I forget, the details are not that important. The point is, in 1378, the Romans demand in big riots that there be an Italian Pope, a Roman Pope in particular. So there's a huge public outcry for a Pope from Italy. And so the cardinals elect a Pope in Italy. And then there's a Pope elected, Italian Pope, seated in Rome. And then the cardinals go back to Avignon. And they elect another Pope. And they claim that they only elected the first one because it was under duress, and so therefore they have to elect an official one, and all of a sudden there's two popes. And the one in Avignon is now known today as the anti-pope. And so the Italian Pope, the Roman Pope, and the Pope in Avignon, they both select their own curia, they have their own cardinals, they have their own legal system, and you have a complete fracture. This is called the Great Schism. It goes from 1378 to basically to, what's the date? 1418, I think. Anyway, they have this schism, and this is very difficult. This is in the midst of the total corruption and collapse of the church and in many other areas in terms of control, the domination by the oligarchy, right, by the regional, I guess not, the regional oligarchy, so to speak, in many other parts of Europe. And so in 1409, a group gets together at Pisa, and these are representatives of the church from all over Europe. It's not a huge number of people, but they decide, no, we're going to fix this. Both of these popes are illegitimate, so we're going to depose both of them, and we're going to elect their own. And so they do so, and all of a sudden there's three popes, because neither of the other two popes assent to this. So you have three popes in 1409, and finally you get to, anyway, I don't need to go through all these details, but it's interesting, and it's part of the strategic situation. You have this chaos. You just have chaos. You have a huge amount of dispute, and people are getting together at councils, and these are not just like dry church councils. These are massive political and cultural and scientific events and the greatest minds of Europe that in politics and in theology and in law show up at these places, people who have been studying everywhere. Okay, so Basel is the first really critical moment in Cusa's career. And I see I'm kind of going over on time. I'm being a little bit wordy, so let me try to shrink it down. And we can have questions in the last half hour. Anyway, so what happens is, how does he get to Basel? Cusa is born in Cuse. Cuse is near Trier, where Helga Zeppler-Rouge was born. This is where Cusa is, or Cuse rather. It's on the Mosel River, and today it's called Bernkastel Cuse because it's been fused with the Bernkastel, which is across the river. And Cusa is born. Nicholas is born to to the Krebs family, as I said. In the Krebs family, his father is a boat maker, a nauta, is what he's referred to as, and he's a high-level merchant. They're not from noble family, but they are. But he's very well respected in society, and there's all these, like, you know, folk stories about Cusa, like, why did he go to Padua? Why did he do this? What was he? He was angry with his father. No, he wasn't cut out to be a boatman. There's like a lot of sort of ideas about that, but nothing that really has any grounding. He has a brother and a sister, and neither of them are nearly as brilliant as him. Okay, in 1416. He goes to, so he's 15 years old, he goes to Heidelberg. Heidelberg is the first German university, and it's founded in the late 1300s. I don't remember exactly what year, but it's relatively new. And for a year he studies in Heidelberg. And then he goes to the University of Padua, which is like the place to be, because at the same time that he's at Padua, he meets, well, Toscanelli is there. And he becomes lifelong friends with Toscanelli, who becomes the leading astronomer, leading mathematician of all of Europe. And he also meets a guy who's very important in his life, who's named Cesarini, or Cesarini, I guess. You know, forgive my pronunciation. Cesarini is the later is the person that Cusa dedicates his great works to. He dedicates the Catholic Concordance from 1433 to 34 to Cesarini. He dedicates Dogma Ignorantia from 1440, and he dedicates On Conjectures from 1441-42. So all three of those great works are dedicated to Cesarini. And then Cesarini, in 1444, is killed in Varna, which I don't have on this map, but it's somewhere around here, by the Turks. And the Duke of Milan blames his death on Venetian treachery. So Cusa has that's one of the situations that he's a part of. So 1423 he gets his doctorate of canon law, and he's a lawyer. And here we see the beginning. Well, actually, let me just get to the next part. He becomes a lawyer, and he's an incredibly capable lawyer. And then he spends a year at the University of Cologne, and he studies theology, and then he goes to Paris for a short amount of time. And at the University of Paris, he does some research into a guy named Raymond Lull, who is a Spaniard who is committed to a sort of mystical theology, is what it's referred to as. It doesn't mean that it's like mystical in the way that you think of it, that people use that word today. Mystical theology is just, if you read Cusa and his negative theology, you'll see that you'll know what we're talking about. But anyway, so let me go on. So in this time period, Cusa becomes an expert in two things. One of them is canon law, and the other one is Plato, basically. And I mean, not specifically Plato, but in other words, the tradition of Platonic thought that stretches from Plato to 1400 to 1420, you know. And all of these particular writers that are affiliated with that tradition, which is the Augustinian tradition, which is really the tradition of St. Paul. It's the tradition of Proclus. It's the tradition of a person that he becomes very much absorbed in, named Dionysius the Areopagite, who was long considered to be a friend of St. Paul, but turns out he wrote 500 years later. So that's where he situates himself. And of course, this is also in the same tradition of Charlemagne, who is influenced by Augustine. So that's another area where we could really do a lot of good work for the organization on Charlemagne. Anyway, so what are the two? So his canon law is the law of the church, and it opposes Roman law. I mean, when Cusa does it, Cusa uses it to oppose Roman law. So he's got his two areas of expertise are the two areas that are necessary to bring down the Venetian Empire. And I think you just got to consider that at this point, I mean, let me just continue. I think that it's in 1440 really that we see that Cusa only concerns himself with the unity of humanity, with all of humanity. And this is really what defines him as a strategic thinker. But let me get there. So over the course of the 1430s, he's asked multiple times to become a professor at a university, I forget exactly where. And he starts doing massive legal work. So he's involved in all kinds of disputes, determining who's right, who's wrong, blah, blah, blah. And there's tons of material left over from this. Then he ends up at the Council of Basel. And let's see. He's defending a guy who says that he should be the Archbishop of Trier, if I remember correctly. And he's trying to argue on the guy's behalf. And that's how he ends up at the council. And people immediately recognize that he's a genius because he's arguing about something that's sort of on a lower level, but he's using a universal way of thinking about, the theory of hierarchy, a theory of canon law, a theory of the church. And so he's brought into the Committee on Matters of Faith. And he's given this significant position within the council. And present at the council, I actually don't know how many people, but there would have been dozens and dozens of representatives, prelates, and cardinals are present, and and papal legates are present, and all these different types of people. And then you have all of their staff, and then you have so it would have been hundreds and hundreds of people. And the way these councils work is that they meet in committees, and then people will stand up and they'll talk for like 3 hours at a time, and they'll give a speech. And in certain situations, people will talk for days at a time. There's some account of Cusa in Germany, and one of these synods that he brings together. A synod is another type of like a local council. I'm not the best on all these specifics, but it's interesting. But he brings together a little synod like maybe 15 years after the Council of Basel, and he speaks for 3 days straight. So, and there's a secretary. All of this stuff is really carefully noted down, so it's all recorded. I mean, that's one of the things about Cusa is that we know tons about his itinerary. We know, about his everything that he was doing on an almost day-to-day basis. The works of Cusa compose a huge set that is still being collected today. Letters that were sent to him in his official capacities. Later he was a bishop, later he was a cardinal. He was even the Vicar General of Rome. All of these things. So we know all about his life and his day-to-day things that he did. So anyway, unlike Toscanelli, who we have nothing that he's written except for the letter to Columbus, which I'll get to soon enough. Okay, so at the Council of Basel, he writes the Catholic Concordance, which is his first great work. And the Catholic Concordance, here's some pictures. I guess I might as well show them now. Here's pictures of today, of present-day Cusa. On the bottom left, you have Cusa's library. His house, or his library, occupies it's in a hospital rather, and it's called a hospital, but really it's a place for impoverished men to live. 33 men live there still today, and this is set up by Cusa towards the very end of his life. He provides funds for it. 33 impoverished men, religious men, get to live there, one for every year of Christ's life. You can see on the top right is his family crest. It's on the Mosel River. You can see that's the building on the bottom right. I think the top left might be his, I'm not certain, I think that might be his birth house. Anyway, the other interesting thing is that Cusa's heart is buried there. The rest of his body is buried in Rome, where he was a bishop, but his heart is buried there. Here's pictures of Cusa. We know what he looks like. On the left is a sculpture of him that is at St. Peter in Chains, the church, the cathedral in Rome where he was bishop, and on the right is an illustration from like a who's who from the 1490s, where famous people got their portraits. You know, not really portraits obviously, but sort of caricatures in a way. Little images of famous people and talking about them. And then on the left here is Cesarini. On the right is Toscanelli. The left is definitely real. The right one might just be someone's imagination. Okay, so here's from the Catholic Concordance. Cusa, okay, since I'm kind of going over on time, let me try to bring it together conceptually. The question you should ask yourself, and you'll learn more about his life, I'll go through it quickly, but the question that you should ask yourself when you're thinking about Cusa is, why does Lyndon LaRouche say that Cusa was the one who came up with the idea of crossing the Great Ocean and founding the United States? I mean, effectively. Why does Lyndon LaRouche attribute that to Cusa when there's no proof of it that I know of in terms of empirical proof, and there's no, as far as I can tell, there's no way to know that empirically. So why does Lynn always say that? And why is it, and you'll find if you investigate Cusa that he's obviously right. But you have to, in terms of discovering a proof of this thing, which is, invisible, so to speak, and doesn't have an apparent sense perceptual reality to it today in terms of what we hold in our hands, that's a question you should ask yourself. And I think that this will provide a lot of clues. So 1433, he writes Concordatia Catholica. He presents it in front of the Council of Basel. He presents a concept of what are you going to do about the problems of hierarchy? This whole absurd Pope situation that I've been telling you about is the strategic situation that he's confronted with. There's no unity within the church, and meanwhile you've got this drastic danger of, on the one hand, the Venetians, and on the other hand, the Turks. So what do you, and just as well, the venality and the corruption of the church. So he says, he lays out an idea for exactly how you're going to get a concordance, a universal concordance that's the basis for any kind of decisions about who gets to rule. And this is excerpted from Bob Ingram's excellent book, The Modern Anglo-Dutch Empire and Its Origins, which you can Google and find online. Cusa says, since natural law is based on reason, all law by nature is rooted in the reason of man. And in Book 3, he says, there is in the people a divine seed by virtue of their common equal birth and the equal natural rights of all man. The equal natural rights of all man. So that all authority, which comes from God, as does man himself, is recognized as divine when it arises from the common consent of all the subjects. That is, that divinely ordained marital state a spiritual union based on a lasting harmony by which a commonwealth is guided in the fullness of peace toward eternal bliss. So compare that, the idea of eternal bliss for a commonwealth, the idea of the equal natural rights of all men. Compare that to the Declaration of Independence and the preamble of the Constitution. And the fact that he bases all of this on the idea that natural law is based on reason, and that all law by nature is rooted in the reason of man. So he appeals to man's reason, right? To man in the image of God. That is to say, man's mind in the image of God's mind. Mind dominates. Reason rules in Cusa's universe. And this has a huge effect. As soon as he starts talking about this, he becomes a celebrity. He's already well known because of the fact that he's also a locator of ancient texts. So he's involved in this great humanist task of pulling out ancient texts and translating them and so forth. He's credited with being an expert in Greek, but so he's already known. But now he's famous at the Council of Basel. Everyone knows him. He's universally loved, except for his enemies, right? And he does some really incredible things. And so anyway, let me just get to the point. The Council of Basel is put together by people who are trying to get away from the Pope. They're tired of the Pope. They're tired. They don't think the Pope should have control over the church, over the Western Church, as he does. They want to change that, and they say, we have a council of representatives, of cardinals, of all types of representatives within the church. We should get to decide things like matters of faith. We should get to decide, the future of the church. And Cusa is involved in this from the standpoint of one thing. He wants unity. He absolutely demands unity. As I'm saying, I think that at this point he's committed to political unity, to church unity, and so forth, and the unity anyway, the ideas of the Commonwealth and the consent of the governed. He's committed to these things. Later, he's committed to a sort of more universal unity, but he's committed to unity in the context of this whole terrible situation that they're in. And the Pope at the time of the Council of Basel is Eugenius IV. Here on the right is Eugenius IV in the Santa Maria del Fiore, consecrating the dome that Brunelleschi has completed in 1436. On the left is Eugenius. I don't know if that's an honest portrayal of him. Anyway, so Cusa is around a bunch of people at the Council of Basel that increasingly to him seem to be totally committed really to their own power, and they're not actually all that interested in unity, and they're not actually all that interested in in the future of the church. They're more interested in cutting the Pope out of things, and this Pope is kind of difficult anyway. So Cusa ends up breaking off with the majority. He ends up leading a minority grouping along with Cesarini on behalf of Eugenius, effectively, to say, you know what we need to do? What we really need to do is to unify the Eastern and the Western churches. That's really what the issue should be. And so he becomes committed to that political goal, which is laid out in Catholic Concordance, but he's committed to that. And so he gets sent famously to Constantinople. And because Cusa becomes granted the responsibility of bringing a Greek delegation to the council, to the council system, and so he does. So you can see this line here. He leaves from Venice in 1437. He shows up in Constantinople. While he's in Constantinople, Cusa doesn't waste any time. He immediately starts recruiting people. He recruits Emperor John VIII. Cusa's not the only person on this mission, but he's one of the most important people. He's the most important person in effect. Anyway, he recruits Emperor John VIII of Byzantium. At this time, the Byzantine Empire has basically been reduced to Constantinople. That's essentially the only thing left. And they're surrounded by the Turks. And so it's difficult, right? And meanwhile, he brings the Patriarch of Constantinople. He brings a guy named John Bessarion, who turns out to be a huge ally. And a few other people come with. A guy named Isidore, who becomes involved. He becomes the Bishop of Kiev. And so he brings these Greeks, and Cusa, while he's in Constantinople, he, like a good humanist, he grabs up a bunch of ancient texts. And so he picks up all of these ancient records of what happened at the early councils in the 400s, 500s, 600s, 700s. He gets all of these together, and he gets a bunch of translations that have never been seen, or a bunch of things that have never been seen in the West. Interestingly, he also picks up a copy of the Quran, translated into Latin, and it's not like it's easy to recruit these people. They have a certain kind of strategic situation they have to deal with, where the emperor is very much interested in unifying with the West because he needs the military support of the West, and he's hoping to avoid the inevitable, which is the conquering of Constantinople by the Turks. And but at the same time, the majority in Constantinople is completely fervently against the union. They are diehard believers that the filioque is heresy. And more to the point, they're enraged at the West for the sack of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade in 1204. They're totally enraged. They're still enraged, 250 years later, that Constantinople was sacked by Westerners. So that's the situation. But Cusa is successful, and on his trip back in 1438, he is famously, he receives a vision from the Father of Lights, which he describes in the opening paragraph to De Docta Ignorantia. And this is the vision that allows him to see to understand incomprehensible truths incomprehensibly. It's the vision that gives him a concept that will change humanity forever, and that will annihilate the Aristotelianism, really, and open the door for Kepler and for all of modern science in the coincidence of opposites and his concept of learned ignorance. So that's the strategic context for what he does. I mean, imagine that. And then I'm going to really breeze through this part. So he comes back to Italy. They arrive back in Venice. There's a new council convened, first in Ferrara, then in Florence. The Greeks bring with them, by the way, there's 700 people who come back from Constantinople. It's a huge group of people. The Pope is going to have to pay for the whole thing, pay for their upkeep, and they don't really have the money to do that. Rome is in a terrible situation, so the Medicis offer to hold it in Florence and to provide for the Greeks, and they do. And there's all kinds of exciting things that happen. One of the people that they bring from Constantinople, his name is Platon. He's on the top right. He is the leading secular Platonic scholar of the day. He starts at the Council of Florence giving public classes on Plato. And his famous document from this period is called The Difference Between Aristotle and Plato. And these public classes recruit the Medicis to found a new Platonic academy in Florence. This is a painting you can see here from within the the chapel of the Magi, and it goes all the way around the inside of the chapel, which you can see this, at the bottom here, and it depicts the three Magi, right? The wise men coming to visit, the three kings coming to visit Christ, and it actually, within the painting, are all of the people who came, or many of the people who came to the Council of Florence. So there's three kings. The young king is Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico. The middle king is the Emperor of Byzantine, John VIII. The old king is Joseph II, the Patriarch, and Platon is in there too, and a bunch of other people are too, including Cosimo de' Medici and many others. So imagine that the Greeks show up in Florence, and there's the most magnificent dome that's ever been built by mankind. Has just been finished. It's much more beautiful, much more impressive, at least, than the Hagia Sophia, and it's completely outrageous that it's been built according to principles that had never been really understood up until Brunelleschi. So, and there's this flowering of art and culture, and the Greeks are convinced. The Greeks, like most of the Greeks, are actually convinced on the Filioque. There's one guy who is not. His name is Saint Mark. He was later sainted by the Orthodox Church, Saint Mark of Ephesus, and he's known as the pillar of orthodoxy because he refuses to accept the Filioque, and he comes back and he basically sabotages the union, because what's achieved is a union between the Eastern and Western churches, famously. But this guy's Mark of Ephesus, he basically sabotages this in Constantinople. Anyway, the point is that they achieve a union. Part of the way that they achieve a union is it's very likely and possible that Cusa actually brought back the documents that Cusa brought back were used. And because what they do say specifically, it's probably, I don't think it's completely clear if it was exactly those documents, but it almost certainly was, because what they prove is that the Filioque is not a heresy. It was not something that came about to change the doctrine. It was actually an explanation of the doctrine that goes back to St. Paul, and in particular St. John, and so forth. And that it was the Eastern Church that broke away, and the Greek fathers that broke away, and they're the ones who are the heretics. And astonishingly, the Greeks, except for this guy Mark, the Greeks accept this idea, and they say, "You're right. The Greek fathers were heretical, and in fact, we do believe in the Filioque." And really, we did believe that all along. We were just using different words. So it's kind of funny. It's difficult. It's messy. There's a lot of political problems, but it's achieved that there's a union. And so you can imagine how the world looks at that point. Astonishingly, after 400 years, there's a union between the Eastern and Western churches, and Cusa's the one who did it. I mean, if it weren't for him, it never would have happened. And so at this point, you have the rest of Cusa's life, which I'm going to be very brief on. But it's very fun and interesting. Cusa is then, he doesn't even get to go to the Council of Florence because he's such a valuable diplomat that he's sent to Germany to convince the German Pope, I mean not German popes, the German princes to side with Eugenius. Because at this point, the Council of Basel kept going. And so the Council of Florence is a break-off from the Council of Basel. So the Council of Basel, you still have all these people that Cusa decided were stupid. I mean, when he breaks off in the minority, he does that after a point at which there's the minority and the majority parties. At one point in time, they stand at opposite sides of the cathedral and they start shouting out their decrees, and they start singing their hymns and so forth, like at each other, right? So Cusa decides this is ridiculous. But in the meanwhile, the Council of Basel keeps on going, and they later have their own anti-pope, who goes for about a decade. I think this is like 1439 to 1449. They have their own anti-pope, Martin V. So there's a big question about whether the German secular power, the princes, are going to side with the Pope, Eugenius, or if they're going to side with the council. And Cusa is sent on a diplomatic mission, and for almost a decade, I guess like 6 or 7 years, he's in Germany trying to win over the princes, and then he does. In 1448, he wins them over at the Congress of Vienna, or not the Congress of Vienna. The name of the agreement is the Concordat of Vienna, and the Germans agree to work with the Pope. And then Eugenius IV dies, and a new Pope comes in, who is Nicolas V, who is like the great Renaissance Pope. He's considered. He founds the Vatican Library. He does all these things. He's a big fan. He's a big fan of Cusa. All of these popes really love Cusa, and then he says, Cusa, you've got to go back to Germany. I'm making you a cardinal. He makes him a cardinal in like 1550 for what he's done with the Concordat of Vienna and everything else. He becomes the cardinal of St. Peter in Chains, which is the cathedral in Rome where they hold St. Peter's chains. Is from when he from in his life when he escaped prison with the help of an angel. And so Cusa, and there's a statue of Cusa there. That's where his tomb is. And so he goes back to Germany, and he does this wild tour of Germany, which is represented on this map here. And he leaves on New Year's Eve in 1450, and he ends his tour in April of 1452. So in that space of time, 16 months, he covers 2,800 miles. He goes everywhere, and and later this is called one of the most important historical events that took place in Germany in this time period. And he goes all over, and he's fighting to reform. And Cusa is like the most devout reformer that you could possibly imagine. Later, he tries to reform the Roman Curia, the cardinals. But in the course of this, he goes, so he goes through Bohemia. He goes all the way up to the Belgium and the Netherlands. He goes through. He goes through the whole territory. And one of the things he's doing is he's trying to. He's putting up what's called wall catechisms, which is the Ten Commandments, the Creed, the Nicene Creed, and prayers in the vernacular in German. He's battling the oligarchy wherever he goes, or that is to say, sort of the feudal powers, the powers of the princes, and so forth, and their control over religion, over the church, and so forth. He's assigned by Nicolas V a diplomatic role in trying to end the 100 Years' War, and Henry VI denies Cusa entrance into England, so he's not able to do that. In May 1452, he decides that we're going to have standardized Bibles, and everyone needs to have the same Bible, and this is considered the first one of the critical, and he does this in Mainz, which is where Gutenberg 3 years later starts printing Bibles. And then in 1453, after this, Constantinople falls. And it's terrible. And it's atrocious. I'm going to finish up here. There's like a lot more to go through, but unfortunately I'm just going over. Maybe I can fill in more during the questions. But in 1453, Constantinople falls because the year before, Mehmet II had taken over the Ottoman Empire. He became emperor of the Ottoman Empire. He reorganized the military. He decided we're going to go after Constantinople. We're going to take it down once and for all. And they do it. And in May of 1453, they start a siege. Or maybe it was April. I guess probably April it starts. By May it's finished. It takes 7 weeks. And the report that the Latins get back from Constantinople is that the Turks are going in and they're just slaughtering people indiscriminately. They kill men and women and children. And actually, it is known that, and it's not clear if that's really what happened. So awfully violent as they profess it to be, but it is known that Mehmed II gives the traditional 3 days of looting to his men. So you have 3 days where you can loot the city whenever you want, and that's what they do. And they get reports in Rome of blood flowing in rivers down the steep streets, and it's horrifying. And all the way through this time, people have been thinking about the crusade, that you're going to have to eventually run against the Turks. We're going to have a war between the West and the East. It's inevitable. We're going to have to do this. And Cusa's friend, Pope Pius II, who comes in after Nicholas, actually attempts to launch this crusade, sort of like triggered by the fall of Constantinople. But what Cusa does, in fact, is that a year after, no, not a year, excuse me, by September of 1453, he writes De Pace Fidei, which is on the Peace of Faith, where he lays out the fact that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all presuppose the one true God. They all have a common ground in the coincidence of opposites. He writes, and it's a heavenly dialogue. It's a dialogue that takes place in heaven. It's a vision that comes to him, just like the doctor does. He says it comes to him in a vision after 7 days of contemplating the horrors of the atrocities of Constantinople. And De Pace Fidei is an idea of a system of nation states operating on the principle of the unity of mankind. And it's probably the most impractical thing that anyone could possibly say. But he's actually committed to this. And I think that, and it's a year later, that in 1454, that a guy he's known since the Council of Basel, John of Segovia, who is an Arabic scholar in addition to many other things, writes to Cusa and says, you know what, we should convene a conference of the leading Islamic and the leading Christian scholars, and we should establish a concordance. And so that's the direction that Cusa wants to go, but instead the practical, way, and that's completely, absolutely directed by the Venetians, is war, is the Crusades. And Pope Pius II, who Cusa has known for many, many decades, is formerly known as Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini, he tries to organize a crusade. It fails. He's given Piccolomini, Pius II has given Cusa a huge amount of responsibility, and Cusa, here's Pius II. He's given him a huge amount of responsibility. He's given Cusa control of Rome while Pius II is out of town trying to raise soldiers for this new crusade. And in 1464, after Cusa's been really fighting like mad to reform the Roman Curia, and it's very, very difficult, Pius says, come with me, we're going to meet with the Venetian Doge, and we're going to get this crusade off the ground. Because finally he's convinced the Venetians they should join the crusade against the Turks. We should get this done. And it's on his way to Ancona, where they're supposed to meet the Venetians, that Cusa dies. Toscanelli is with him. A very important guy named Fernando Martin is with him, who's a canon in Lisbon, at the Cathedral of Lisbon. His secretary, Giovanni Debussy, is with Cusa at his death. Debussy is the one who says that Cusa is the one who really brought printing to Italy in the 1450s. And this is where I'm just going to end up. Ask yourself, what was he talking about with Toscanelli, with Debussy, with Martin, on the road to Ancona? I'll show you on the map here where Ancona is. What was he talking about on that road? Do you think that Cusa thought that a crusade was going to work? Okay, so if you see here, Rome is Q, Todi, where he dies, is V, and T is Ancona. At Ancona are waiting Pius II and 11 Venetian galleys, ships, prepared to carry troops, and the Venetian Doge, the head of the Venetian quote-unquote republic, right? So what were they thinking about, and what were they talking about when they were crossing Italy to get over to Ancona? They didn't. Let me give you one more piece here, and then I'm going to sort of close it out. Here is something that Aeneas Silvio said before he was Pope about the Venetians. As among brute beasts, aquatic creatures have the least intelligence, so among human beings, the Venetians are the least just and the least capable of humanity. They please only themselves, and while they talk, they listen to and admire themselves. When they speak, they think themselves sirens. They wish to appear Christian before the world, but in reality, they never think of God. And except for the state, which they regard as a deity, they hold nothing sacred. The Venetians aim at the dominion of Italy and all but dare to aspire to the mastery of the world. So imagine that that's what they think about the Venetians. And at the time of Cusa's death, they're going to actually get help from the Venetians. They've finally they've given in. Well, actually, Pius II has given in. You can imagine what would happen if Cusa were Pope, and he received votes to become Pope. He could have been Pope, but instead, Pius II, I think, is a very practical person. He gives in, and they're on the road. So what were they talking about? And you will have a hint to what they were talking about if you know that Christopher Columbus, in his library, had a book that is the histories written by Pius II. It's called the history, a history of the world, written by Pius II. And in this book, in his library, was discovered a letter that was a copy in Columbus's hand of a letter that was written by Toscanelli to Fernando Martin, who was president at Cusa's death. And this is a letter talking about how you're going to get to the east by going west, right? How are you going to get, what does it mean to cross the great ocean? And Toscanelli lays out a plan for doing so, and why you would do it too, because it's not it's not just about the trade routes. It's because you're going to have communion with the rest of civilization, and you're going to change the strategic situation forever. So that's the question you got to ask yourself. What were they talking about? How did this come together? What were the principles that led Toscanelli and Martin 10 years later to have this dialogue, and then Toscanelli sent a map along with this letter to Columbus, and Columbus' son and a couple of other histories say that Columbus used this map constantly. He took it with him everywhere. So I could go on for another while, but let me cut there and open it up for questions. And we can go until 9, I hope. Okay. So just unmute yourself and ask away if you have anything that comes to mind.
Hey, Daniel?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a bit on when Cusa had this vision when he was coming back from Constantinople on the coincidence of opposites, how this idea is like what Lynn talks about in making a leap in a discovery, how it's non-deductive, how that, talk about that in relation to what was going on in Padua with this brainwashing of Aristotle and logic, and can you say something on maybe how that functions, or I don't know, just elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth considering that Cusa's not the first person to talk this way. So you really got to ask yourself. We're talking about these subjects, but he does it in a completely different way, and he makes a unique discovery about that advances Socrates' method, it advances Plato's method in a completely unique way. because he's studying all of the Platonic writers that have kept these ideas alive in over the centuries. You know, he has a huge library that's filled with Neoplatonic thinkers. And you can imagine what got his juices flowing in Constantinople, finding all of these things. But the best way to look at it, I think, is to look at what his detractors had to say about it, because there was an attack on De Docta by a guy named Wenck, John Wenck, or Wenck, I don't really know, but Will calls him Wenck. So Wenck, who is based, you know what, it escapes me right now. I think Wenck is at Heidelberg, but he might not be. Anyway, when he writes is, Cusa, with your method of coincidence of opposites, Cusa with his method of coincidence of opposites, has completely rejected the Aristotelian rule that opposites are opposite and that they can't coincide, and that's what makes them opposite. And this, so that he writes this in 1444. And Cusa writes an apology, that is a rebuttal, a defense of De Docta, in which he says, that's exactly right. That's exactly what I'm saying. Aristotle and people who adhere to the Aristotelian sect can never understand these things. It would take a miracle for someone who is of the Aristotelian sect to grasp what I'm talking about here, in terms of truth and grasping incomprehensible truths incomprehensibly. Because Cusa's whole, as you learned from Will's presentation in particular, Cusa's whole method is to put forward paradoxes. And you have to elevate your thinking to beyond your own rational intellect and onto a higher platform. In one of his, on the vision of God, he talks about the coincidence of opposites as being the wall around paradise. And within paradise, you can actually, attain unto God's truth. You can you can come to know not truth as truth, but you can come to know incomprehensible truth incomprehensibly. But in order to get there, you have to get over the wall. And the wall is this understanding of the coincidence of opposites that relates to a question of, like in De Docta, he talks about the maximum and the minimum. And he says that if you can conceive of these concepts of maximum and minimum prior to the concept of quantity, then you can see that they're actually united. Although they appear to be opposites, if you can think in a higher way, you can see that they ontologically come prior to quantity, which is subsequent, and that they are superlatives, both of them. So he asks you to think, if you want to think about God, if you want to actually figure out truth, then you have to think about a world where maximum and minimum are identical. And that's the absolute maximum, than which there can be nothing greater. Actually, let me refrain from getting too much into that in case I make a mistake. But anyway, you have to get to this world where those opposites are actually one. And that directly violates all of the Aristotelian precepts of law. I mean of logic, but also of law. And it is a way of strategic thinking that violates, that would exterminate the Venetian, any kind of imperial method. How can you have color revolutions in a world that adheres to the truth of the coincidence of opposites? How could you trick people into thinking that we're in a state of war where one faction's always going to come out on top? How can you say what the Aristotelians say, which is that some people are born masters and some people are born slaves, and that's the way it is. If you think the way that Cusa elevates humanity towards thinking. So what he was doing was destroying Aristotle, and in doing so destroying the strategic advantage of the Venetians, of the empire, not the Venetians really, but the empire, of empire per se. Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. It seems like, I mean, obviously this idea of the filioque, which they were fighting for in the Trinity, is the same thing, because, or what would lead to the Renaissance, because if you have an affirmative idea of what human beings actually are, then is being in the image of the Creator, then there's no limit to what you can actually organize your society to achieve. So,
yeah, absolutely. Here's something that is worth doing real quick. This is from Helga's article, Nicolas of Cusa and the Council of Florence from 1992, on that question of the filioque. Even if the significance of the union of the churches over the issue of filioque is undervalued by the majority of our contemporaries, they are at the very heart of the values of our Christian humanist culture and the values of the Christian West. If we lose this knowledge, we will also lose what is most precious, that which is at the basis of our conception of man. The emergence of Christianity marks the greatest turning point in human history. By becoming man, Christ broke the cyclical image of history, which had been the leading feature of pagan, pre-Christian myths and cults. With Christ, who is at the same time man and God, man made in the image and likeness of God became capax Dei, that is, capable of participating in God, and thus capable of infinitely increasing self-perfection and approach to God. Only with the Son of God who becomes man, with the passion and resurrection, was man's redemption made possible. God's capacity to become man and man's capacity to participate directly in God is the basis of the inalienable dignity of every man. No other monotheistic religion believes that God has become man. What Christianity allows man is his liberation, his freedom through necessity. That's all Helga. And then she quotes, okay, she says, for Cusa, Christ gives meaning to the universe, and his followers are those who give meaning to man. Thus he writes in the beautiful sermon, Confide, My Daughter, of 1444, let us seek in ourselves what Christ is. If we do not find him in ourselves, then we will not find him at all. Then he continues with the following observation. Until such time as man reaches life in his own humanity, this is Cusa, until such time as man reaches life in his own humanity, the true cause of every life, in truth, cause of all that is true and acceptable, and in the good, cause of all that is good and to which it is right to aspire, he will never reach his aim. He will never have peace. So until such time as man reaches life in his own humanity, in truth and in the good, he will never have peace. How true and how right it is to affirm that the root of all unhappiness for those who today hastily and restlessly chase after pleasure lies in the fact that they believe they can realize their own humanity in some way other than by seeking Christ within themselves. So that's Helga's thought on the filioque. And you can see how without that, how could you ever have the United States? How could you ever have the Massachusetts Bay Colony? How could you ever have any progress against the oligarchy and for mankind? And also you can see in that the idea that Lynn is putting forward right now, the critical strategic concept that has to become predominant among leaders in the world, which is the Renatskin concept of mankind, that mankind is the only measure of man in the universe, and that this a higher scientific development from Cusa defines any system of nation states that passed the system of warfare that we have today. It's what are you going to, if Tony Blair is out, you know, and Obama goes, then what comes in? And it's got to be a society on the basis of these conceptions. All right, so I'm sorry. What? Any other questions? We can go as long as people want to. I know there's a call at 9, but if anyone wants to stay on, they can.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask a question then.
Hold on, we can't hear you. I could hear you at first, but not anymore. See, you're not muted, but I just can't hear you. Maybe you muted it on the keyboard? Okay, I tried muting you. Okay, good. I still can't hear you. Okay, looks like they're logging back in.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay. NSA.
So I'll make it quick because we should get on this call. So I was just wondering of this issue of the filioque, and if you had looked into much of the conflicting ideas that came up when, you know, because Cusa was organizing around this. It sounds like as the central basis for peace among these different schools of thought, but then it sounds like you also had major disagreement, and I'm wondering, you know, one, is that from operations like Venetian operations, or was that just from differing cultural backgrounds? And then that was the other question I had was, you brought up something along the lines of the Greeks at the Council of Florence, that they didn't necessarily agree with the with what Cusa was saying, but then he organized them around something that clicked in their mind as being something that they had actually believed in, going way back to the Platonic school and whatnot. And I was wondering if you had looked much into that in terms of these differing ideas and how Cusa organized, you know, or if you got something to say to that.
Well, I think it's a great question, because I don't understand why the Eastern Church became heretical. I don't understand why they broke away from the filioque. I mean, you've got to presume it's the empire. Of course it's the empire. And it's the empire. It's not like the Venetian empire or this or that or the other. It's just the empire. Specifically, well, you know, what's the Roman Empire as it becomes the Venetian Empire. And whatever evil is going on in you know, Byzantium, so to speak. But so I think that's a good question. That's a good area of research to figure out why. Because all I know specifically is that, you know, 1054 essentially they made it clear we're not gonna accept that. We're not gonna accept the filioque. What I was saying in terms of, see, all of the major Greek representatives, including the emperor, were convinced by the filioque. We're actually convinced by the, I mean, why? Because, well, again, because they're showing up, they're seeing the effects of the culture within Florence, And because you have the greatest minds of civilization are there arguing on behalf of the filioque, of the idea that man is, like, Christ was a man, was a God man, was a man God, right? And that therefore humanity can aspire unto human creativity. That human creativity is a principle of God's universe and of the way that the Creator operates. That human creativity and creativity per se are one. I think that's the way to think about it. They're one from a certain vantage point. It's not totally universal, but that they are one in Christ, for example. Okay, so most of them were convinced in a rather stunning turn, but not all of them were. This guy Mark was not convinced. He was, I guess he was the metropolitan, which means he was from Ephesus. I guess he was a bishop. He was bishop of Ephesus. He was dead set against it. And if you go to like an Orthodox website and you read about the Council of Florence, they call it the false Council of Florence. And they talk about what traitors all these people were. And they say that Mark was the only one who stayed true. So part of this is fed by the political situation, because Pope Eugenius IV, Eugenius is Pope at the time, he's a difficult guy. He's not nearly as brilliant as Cusa and some of Cusa's peers were, I think. And he's not a very smooth operator. But he's dedicated to restoring the papacy. And so the council, through the developments of the council, the Greeks are convinced, except for Mark. They put together a papal bull that says, this is the story. It's called, the name of the bull is The Heavens Rejoice, in which they establish the unity around the filioque. There's other concerns. Purgatory is one of them. There's differing ideas of purgatory. But in the bull, what Eugenius knows that John VIII is desperate for the union because the Turks are at his door. So Eugenius, he sneaks in, or he bullies in, I don't know, he makes sure that within the bull that they have to agree to is something that says that the Eastern Church is going to be subordinate to the Pope and have to pay respect to the Pope in various ways. So out of the agreement, the Orthodox Church also gets it gets troops from the Pope, they get certain protections from the Pope, various other things. But so that's what I mean, and then it's kind of messy, because it is a very important political event. At the same time that it's much more, of a much higher importance is the theological implication and the cultural implications and so forth. But it's extremely important politically. And Eugenius makes it, he makes sure that the Pope comes out on top. That's what I mean. So there's some speculation about, this. I mean, basically, Emperor John is in a situation where he really has to agree to this. He can't, at least that's what he thinks. And so he's willing to say, yeah, the Pope's supreme, even if, theologically he doesn't necessarily agree with that. Because at this point it's just completely political. Does that make sense?
I'll take it.
I mean, the other thing of note is what I was saying about the fact that there's
Daniel. We should. We should go. I think Helga's starting.
Oh yeah, Helga's on the call tonight. I didn't realize that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Alrighty.
Bye.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. Great. Very good.
Good.